Hi,
Sure.
by the way. Nice to meet you.
Hi, very nice to meet you. Yes. I don't know too much about you, but I know you work at Perpectivia with
Hmm.
with Zach Stein, who I just had an extraordinary interview with. And I know you work with horses, and I know you do qigong, and that you lead insight retreats. And I also know that you write these extraordinary texts on Medium and have a sort of ability to combine very high abstraction with very down to earth sorts of issues. So did you want to just sort of introduce yourself or say something about what you're trying to do,
Yeah.
what's your angle, what's your unique thing?
Um, yeah, I've been thinking about that over the last year or so because people always ask me that. And I think my answer's gotten to be more refined. Um, at first, I stumbled over it a lot more. Um, so my current version of where I am in this space is, and I like that way you put it in that email, what's your parallax, what's your orthogonal or side view,
Mm-hmm.
is, and maybe we can get into why this matters, but, I'm a person that has been looking for new architectures of thought for a long time, and partially because I think that I've been a thinker that thinks in different ways, but also that as I studied philosophy and read people's writings over many, many years, I started to see, wow, there's a lot of philosophy within a certain canon. There's a lot of writing in a certain scientific paradigm, but there are actually, you could start to see like this genesis of uh, different ways that people are constructing thought. And I started getting very interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to do, I guess, now after maybe 20 years of this is I really see a lot of hope in combining a process philosophical approach, a la Whitehead, and then there's many versions of that, but look, we could anchor that in Whitehead.
Sure.
With like embodied and active approaches of Thompson and Varela, let's say, they're also in that process field.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of integrate that with what I call holistic complexity science, which is not cybernetics, it's not second or third order cybernetics, it's really kind of a new science. I would say that Dave Snowden and Nora Bateson are in that field.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow I think that there's a new architecture or a new paradigm of mind that's going to draw on a lot of those resources. My current term for what that theory looks like, what that combination looks like, is complex potential state theory, which is a move away from complex adaptive states, a Darwinian kind of understanding of complexity, to a more emergent novel. So complex potential states, and that of course draws from process philosophy. So even in I'm writing a big paper or small book for Perpectivia on transformational approaches to education, drawing on this notion of complex potential states. Can I bring forth the potential? What's the potential from here? What are these pre-egoic evolutionary potentials of the human, right? So yeah, that's kind of where all my work, even in organizations, I talk about complex potential states in education. Yeah, so I would say that's kind of the sphere around which my intellectual life
Okay.
revolves.
And I did this interview with Zach Stein that I'm still thinking about a lot, and there was a quote that Zach used, and that quote was, and you suggested that we start talking about this. The quote was that schools make you stupid, money makes you poor, and medicine makes you sick. So we're talking about the dysfunction of organizations, right?
Yeah.
and I believe you work very hard to try to heal these dysfunctions and also to try to bring forth human potential.
Mhm.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, so that I love that when he said that, and I kind of sent it around the Twitter sphere, and so why does I would like to talk about why does that ring true? I mean,
Right.
I thought about that because on one hand it seems kind of like a funny thing to say, but it does ring true, and it points to the sense-making crisis, the war on sense-making and the meaning-making crisis. So I want to step back and say why I think this rings true. And there's something like it's not like we invented schools to make us stupid. There's like a conspiratorial kind of feel to them because they're all
Mm,
happening at the same time. And this
mm,
is part of the paranoia in the social media space right now, is because people feel like all these things have a common reason, and they project that as a cabal of a few people. But they
mm,
do have a common reason, but the common reason is not a cabal of few people. It has to do with um, um, what we're seeing is the reversal of intention and outcome, right? So schools, the intention is to educate, the
mm.
outcome is makes us stupid.
So there's good intentions, but that's leading to this often terrible outcome.
Yes, and in our everyday life, I have a good intention to protect my family and my country, and it leads to nuclear war. I have a good intention to play the game by the rules, and it turns into fraud. I have a good intention to make a home and a good life and career for my family, and it destroys the environment. So what we
Oh,
see is this reversal or decoupling of intention and outcome, and you kind of
and
see it everywhere.
what that makes me think of is that it's the result of a mono perspective of some kind.
Yeah, okay, exactly. It's a result of the long process of decreasing returns
Hmm.
in the cycles of civilization, and then you get a reversal. I mean, the returns decrease to the benefits and the returns start to tip.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what we're looking at, I mean, we live, as Zach says, in a time between worlds. We're living at the end of a very large paradigm, a very large cycle of civilization, and
Mm,
this has happened before. We're lucky to be able to conceive it as the end of a cycle of
yeah.
civilization.
He
And
calls it he says we're living in the post-tragic age, which is I thought an interesting concept. That
yeah,
this in-between world place is sort of like, um, it's the tragedy of modernity, which I guess has to do with, all of these institutions kind of falling apart. And
yeah.
then, no, sorry, and the tragedy of postmodernity is more like we don't know what to do. Uh-huh. And
Well, the
we
problem with a
flatten it.
paradigm,
Mhm.
so there's like the problem with the paradigm we're in is that the modernity and its critique are in the same paradigm.
Yeah.
Now,
Hmm.
this is why it's so tough. This is why this is like the mother of all paradigms, right? And
Hmm.
so if you think about it, in the past paradigms, there was not a conceptual critique of the paradigm itself. It just evolved, and Rome just uh,
Hmm.
destroyed itself by just action. But here
Ah.
in modern times, we start to see, we get postmodern critique. And so what you have with paradigms, they're either inconsistent or they're incomplete. Now, inconsistent paradigms don't live very long. They're not very robust, because so you start to have a lot of relativistic, um, movement between paradigms.
Hmm.
But in our modern society, we get the postmodern critique. The postmodern critique starts shoring up all the inconsistencies of the modern paradigm,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes it much more complex. So you get this complex, systemic, hyper-systemic understanding of modernity from postmodern, but it started to close up all the loopholes. So it actually made it more robust and more recursive. And so the game is kind of closed on itself, and the reversal's happening because not only of the inconsistencies of the modern paradigm, but we've shored it up with the critiques, right? All the regulation in business and all the hyper surveillance of AI and all the systems keeps shoring up those inconsistencies. So now we have a very robust paradigm, very closed on itself, but it's incomplete. And this is the challenge, not to look for inconsistencies, but we have to see what we can't see. We have to, and this is exactly what you said, we're closed in a paradigm, and the job is we have to see outside of it.
Yeah. So
No longer,
when you say we have to see what we can't see, you're thinking about the future. But also I was wondering if we have to find a thread to the past. In other words, we have to kind of rediscover some of the, the narratives of the past, or the grand narratives of the past, to move us into the future. So so we're not just starting from nowhere. Does that
okay, exactly. Yes, and there's people that are working like that, going back to archetypes and this and that, but this was what makes me different. That's not radical enough. So the instinct that we have to go backwards to go forwards, yes, because you can't just start here and then emerge from nothing. But we have, because the paradigm is linguistic and symbolic, we have to go to pre-linguistic and pre-symbolic modes of being, and then build from there.
Wow.
So the archetypes are not the place to start.
So further back than further back. So like, I don't know, my friend Alexander Bard talks about nomadology and trying to look at the dynamics of early tribes and how they work, and the Dunbar number and all that, how people work together. I guess that's still working within an archetypal model.
Exactly. It's not deep enough. So now, but you see quite a lot of people that are saying, and we need to go back to the sensory motor perception action mode of being. We actually have to reclaim a lot of that, because I do work with horses, and literally people get so lost in thought they cannot see what's happening to them in their sensory motor spatial relationships. They either get completely overwhelmed with emotion or completely overwhelmed with theory in their daily lives. And so you start to see, and this is why our culture has like extreme sports. There's this intuitive need, Evan Thompson's work, Adam Roberts' work at the side view. It's all something in us. Jordan Hall says this. You have to be in right relationship. You have to be sovereign. You have to choose and act. We're going all the way back down to these deep codes or protocol of embodied choice, experiment, and action. So there's so
we're split, right? We're very split, let's say, between the brain and the body. Like the whole culture is extraordinary split between embodied experience and abstraction.
Yeah, I mean, so the question is, what comes on top of I call that the core self, the embodied sensory motor perception action self? Is there another linguistic symbolic system that gets built on that? Probably. It just won't be the paradigm that we have now. And so there will be, that's the possibility for emergent type of minds, right? Because the architecture of mind has changed through time with these transformations of civilization.
So maybe you could unpack a little bit, this, I guess, Francis Varela's idea of autopoiesis and emergent theory and all of that. I'm not sure if I understand it in the sense of self-organization. If there's self-organization, then how do we work with that? Does that make, is my question clear?
Yeah, I'm going to riff on it instead of going deep into the theory.
Okay.
So I do a presentation, and that's called How Self-Organization Happens and Why Does It Matter, or Why You Can Trust It, or something. And one of the slides I put up are you can find it on the internet, and it's this animation of DNA being unraveled and copied in a ribosome factory. This is like,
right.
and it's all molecular self-organization. So I say,
Mm,
well, how does that happen? How does that, not only that, but there's autopoietic cycles, so it perpetuates itself. I'm like, the ribosomes are just molecules. They don't have DNA,
mm,
right? But all of life is predicated upon the fact that they self-organize in these extremely complex factories, right?
mm,
Nobody knows how to do what
yeah,
they do. So self-organization is not trivial.
yeah.
It's deeply intelligent, and it's deeply um, um,
Well, I guess
int-
nature is intelligent, right? I mean, nature is complex and intelligent, and we're a part of nature. But we also we construct things like machines, and we kind of believe that those are complex.
no, but
Whereas compared to a blade of grass or something like that, our machines are very, very, very dumb or very simple.
yeah, so machines don't self-organize, right? I mean, and then you could say, well,
Okay.
machines can build other machines, but then now we have to think about the notion of self-organization. Um, and machines build each other up from parts, and self-organization are patterns of relationship
Hmm.
that make, that create more complex types of potentials,
Hmm. Okay.
right? So I like to talk about self-organization in every relationship. In a self-organized relationship, there's a promise that is made for a higher possibility, right? So
Mm.
if and this cuts across living and non-living things, right?
Mm.
So if I'm working with a horse as a farmer and plowing the land, there's a promissory note between me and the horse for a larger possibility. The
Mhm.
horse and I,
Mhm.
right? And so you start to see that that's kind of just an instoried way to talk about self-organization.
Yeah, but it
But
can go the other way too, right? If you don't cultivate that relationship in a good, in a positive or in a correct manner, then the relationship can degrade, right? Self-organization can go backwards.
exactly.
Uh-huh.
So if so some people can talk about it as an energy kind of equation. So at the higher
Mhm.
level, it's got to be a lower energy state or lower energy cost. So that's the
Uh-huh.
possibility. So molecules work like that. If we get together, there's a lower energy cost for something that we're doing, so that we're going to promise to interact in this certain way. I like to say, if my cells didn't promise to get up to if my cells didn't promise to keep doing what they were doing, I couldn't get up and walk across the room.
Uh-huh.
But you can start to see this like from an active approach, and I think this is where Varela was really inspired, is you could start to see yourself inside the universe of self-organization and this notion of promise and possibility. So like if the way a stone is, right? The laws of nature are like deep promises. So if the stone didn't
That's beautiful.
promise
Yeah.
to lay upon the ground, I couldn't pick her up and throw it. And you start to get this completely animated participatory process view of reality is all promise and participation.
Promise is the same thing as potential, or I'm trying
Yeah,
to understand what you mean
yeah.
by promise. Yeah. Uh-huh.
There's every relation, like in process, it's relation. Every
Yeah.
relation is both a promise so that there can be enacted a higher potential,
Okay.
right? So so the laws of nature are like promises. Nature promises to behave a certain way in order
Mm.
for other potentials to come across.
So they're not archetypes or ideals in the Platonic sense or something like that. They're promises. That's very interesting. I like
Well,
that.
it's kind of the way to talk about what is self self-organization from a process view. You know, they're relational dynamics that in from a easy way to understand it and to bring out the kind of beauty of a world that is seen through this way, you can think of it as promise and possibility at different levels, you know. So there's this, and that really brings up the way Whitehead thought of his philosophy. He talked about, you know, prehension as feeling. It was the long, it's a very you know, this notion of promise and possibility has a lot of feeling, a lot of affect to it. And this is the world that he wanted to bring forth, this notion of not just making connections, like wiring things together, but that there was tones, there was affect on both sides of the equation. And so I turned that into this phrase about promises and possibility. And this is actually what a society is. You know, you promise to obey certain rules and certain patterns because everybody, it's going to enact a higher possibility for everyone. It's what a company is. It's what self-organization is. It's a set of promises to realize a greater possibility. And when the promises are being upheld and the possibilities are not, then you start to have some breakdown.
And so then we can, maybe that's a segue into talking about education again, going back into education and this sort of breakdown you're talking about, and what to do to, well, to create genuine self-organizing, let's say, education. Zach distinguishes between education and school. Like he has this, you know, and Ivan Illich wrote a book called Deschooling Society. So I guess my question is, so you know about organizations and how they work, and what is education going to be like, and what is it now, and you know, in the internet age, and how do we educate ourselves today? I'm asking this question because I'm thinking about how, like, this conversation we're having, and then also my interactions on internet, and then my job, and all these things in different compartments, and how does the whole thing work? How do we do that? How do we fulfill the promise of education, if you like? Using the word promise again.
That's interesting. So again, when you ask me a question like that, I have to start by saying, okay, the whole discourse around education is in this paradigm. So I make the distinction between education reform, which has not exited the paradigm. So all those moves will give you decreasing returns, increasing complexity, won't get you out of the pickle. So that's education reform. So what we need is transformational philosophy, a new transformational philosophy of education, what Zach Stein would call a theory of a new theory of the human.
New theory of the human.
Yeah, so you have to step way back. And so a new philosophy of education requires a new theory of learning. How do people learn?
I want to just go back a little bit about the human. Well, what would this new idea of the human be? As a learner, I guess, or
as
somebody...
a learner, exactly. So the new idea of how people learn, how do humans learn, and so we have to examine assumptions. For example, in our current paradigm, we have what I call a developmental bias. We think the past is primitive and the future is more complex, and that development is linear. So this is how we think people, linear and additive. This is how we think people learn. And so it turns out this is not true. The amount of information that your body processes just to get to being like a perceiving, walking, sensing, feeling organism is like 11 billion bits a second. And the cognitive, neurocognitive linguistic mind can only handle like 14 to 64 bits per second. Most of the intelligence in us is in this embodied organism.
Or is in our body, and also in our deep history, I guess, or in our
yeah. And so they're in genetic and epigenetic evolutionary potentials, right? So first of all, we need to think of education not as, so this is what we think about education. So the child goes to first grade or kindergarten, and we say, oh, the embodied child is that phase is over. Now we're going to do this phase, and then we're going to do this phase, and now they have to learn abstractions, and now they're going to do this. We have this feeling that we have to add all these things on top. Now we learn science. Now we learn science in a more complex way or whatever. But what we really need to do is say the embodied core self. We're actually educating four selves. This is a kind of a maturation of the theory of Donald Oliver, who was one of the first philosophers of education that took a process approach. So again, this is in my whole sphere. But we have to educate the core self. So the sensory, motor, perception, action self has to be educated. And this requires a lot about the family environment and the nutrition, early childhood nutrition. So without focus on this, then the society's lost anyway. So we have the core self, and then we have the communal self. The communal self is a self that can create relationships, the civic engagement, the self that can speak, that can participate in group process, that creates larger and larger spheres of inclusion. This is the communal self. Now, the communal self doesn't come after the education of the core self. The communal self is the core self expanded into communal possibilities. So now we have to educate both. There's a transformation that happens in this potential of the human. It's not just their learning.
Is this something like this sort of transcendent include idea? Is that, or is that not quite it? I have a feeling that's not quite it.
That's not it at all, because transcend means you've left the stage behind, and I'm saying this is exactly the developmental bias.
Oh, right.
The stage it's a developmental theory, it's not from complexity science. So and this is why it's got a lot of holes. There's a big problems, but so one of the problems with our paradigm today is it has a developmental bias, and all of that developmental stage theory has a developmental bias. So what we're looking at is there's the core self, and then it complexifies to the core self and the communal self. The core self has certain psychological schemas. The communal self has other structures. The identity changes, the organism changes, the potential changes. What is possible from here now? And then you're going to educate into the cosmopolitan self, which right now the cosmopolitan self is all of what education teaches, just stuff. Doesn't get back down to what is the core psycho-spiritual self that I'm educating at this point in the lifespan. It doesn't concern itself with that. So
we're forgetting the earlier stages, so to speak. Like we should continue to nourish those earlier stages
because they're not just earlier. They're more fundamental, and they're
not earlier. So it's not a linear time thing. It's something else.
They're more fundamental, and they need to grow along with the lifespan. It's like saying, I put my foundation down, and now I'm going to build a house. Now I'm going to build a bigger house. No, my foundation has to grow holistically. It's a holistically complex participation of complex psyches, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but we actually exclude so in our society, we exclude the kind of psycho-spiritual growth that should be happening in the family and onwards. But what we have is a very short window of time, if you happen to have a healthy nuclear family, for psycho-spiritual growth to happen. Then you get into schools. No psychology, no spiritual growth allowed.
Yeah.
You just get information. So we
So by psychology and spiritual growth, you mean working on your affective self, doing practices like meditation and martial arts, and orienting yourself with nature and
exactly
things like that.
These things need to grow throughout the lifespan. So what we have today, I teach a master's course in consciousness studies and transformational psychology. I get, by the time people are 40 or 50 years old, they say, oh, I want to do exactly that. I want to work on my mindfulness and my trauma and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole point is we educate and condition all these things until people are 50 years old.
Yeah.
And then when they're 50, we have to decondition ourselves to go forward. But by then it's too hard. You have to be at a fourth or fifth level of consciousness to metacognitively deconstruct what the society has constructed for the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we know children are intuitively collaborative and empathic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then we say, oh, Keegan's fourth or fifth order consciousness, people become collaborative and empathic. Why does it take a fifth order consciousness for people to be that? Because the way we educate or school today is we school competitiveness and non-empathy. So by the time you're 50, you have to have a very strong metacognitive mind to deconstruct your early conditioning. So the whole project is inadequate to what we need.
To what we need. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wrote down one of my questions. I was listening to one of your talks. You talked about competition versus consensus, and it's like on some level we have hyper competition, and on another level we have hyper conformity or consensus. In our relationships and how we're supposed to be with each other, and so the middle ground would be creativity, right? In relationships or something.
Yeah. So that comes in my work with self-organized like organizations, at that level of analysis. And what it's based upon a model of collective action that shows that there's kind of like complex feed loops. In holistic complexity science, what you encounter is things that are very similar to the brain. Like the brain doesn't just have feed forward loops. Some brain areas of the brain, when they get excited, inhibit others. But then when they're inhibited, they uninhibit other things that get excited, but then might inhibit that, very complex feed loops. So when you're working with holistic complexity, you're always working with very complex feed loops that create threshold events. So
what's an example of a threshold event?
So as that's happening in my brain, I may, or could use Vervaeke's language, something may or not become salient because things are inhibiting and disinhibiting each other all the time until something switches and there's more inhibition or more excitatory above a certain level of consciousness, and then I have a threshold event, okay?
Yeah, okay.
But the feed loops inside that system are not just this amplifies that, and amplifies that until there's a threshold event. Okay, so
Vervaeke calls it opponent processing or something, that there's a back and forth between
exactly.
there's different modes of being, and and then you come to some kind of consensus or some kind of, or as you say, threshold where you some kind of insight or
Exactly.
is
The
that right?
processing that's happening has complex feed loops.
Yeah.
So it's not just, for example, um, this, so this neuron tickles that neuron and amplifies that neuron and then it crosses a threshold event. That would just be a linear feedback loop. Just it's all feed forward.
Hmm.
There's
There's a
this
back and forth, a push and pull,
exactly. There's
like
a
you
back and
say
forth.
in Qigong.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so much more complex space of possibility until there's a threshold event. So this happens in organizations also. And, and this kind of answers some of the questions in this social media space about hierarchy and privilege and stuff. So an organization also.
Sorry, what were you referring to? Questions of hierarchy in the social media space. I'm not sure if
You
I got.
like the whole, you talked about the difference between consensus and competition and hierarchy and egalitarianism.
Oh, okay.
So we have to look at societies and organizations. They also are a dynamic that has complex feed loops.
Yeah.
So, for example, what I call it the feed loops fork, right? So you can't just, for example, teach social justice concerns over and over and over at school, because then the feed loop will fork. You'll get the reverse outcome from your intention. Because
you'll get a bunch of fascists when you're trying to create a bunch of very helpful, kind people or something.
Yes, because the human collective intelligence has complex feed loops. You can't just feed forward or feed backwards. That's not how complex holistic systems work. So in an organization, I'll give you a very easy example of how we use it in organizations. As trust let's say you're working with a team, as trust goes up, right? You're getting to know each other. As trust goes up, what we call action thresholds, the thresholds for action go down. So you no longer have to get everybody to agree, no longer require consensus, because you have high level of trust. Same we do with our kids. The more we trust them, we give them the keys. We buy them a car, okay? So as trust goes up, the thresholds for action go down. As the thresholds
and the need for hierarchy, I guess, becomes less.
No. No.
Or natural hierarchies kind of develop or something.
Exactly. As the action thresholds go down, small differences in skill become larger, and you'll get a natural hierarchy. And when that happens, trust goes down. So you have this kind of two-cycle kind of thing. And so in the dominant discourse, all we have is polarized discourse. Those are against hierarchies and those that want this. But if we come at this from a new paradigm of complex, holistic systems, we see, we're dealing with a complex feed loop. And this is part of all living systems. And so the interesting thing is all societies have actually adjusted themselves unconsciously for these feed loops. We can't help ourselves. We're self-organized ecologies of living things.
It seems like whatever we try to do, we make it worse. Or when you're talking about that, I was thinking, yes, there's this complexity of behavior, and then there's our attempts to try to manipulate that behavior, and how often that has a negative outcome. Again, we're back to the same thing you were talking about at the beginning about good intentions.
Because we do technological innovations from a mindset that doesn't have holistic complexity. We do technological interventions from either a linear developmental mindset, or a control
So how would you create
mindset.
technology in the manner that you're suggesting?
How would I create
Well,
technology?
not you personally, but I mean, how would one like how would you create technology where, let's say, the technology is not dominating the human being? Like
Yeah,
I get the feeling on social media that it's kind of it's such a destructive ecosystem, like 99% of Facebook, you
yeah.
know, and there's like 1% that might be positive, you know.
Okay. So, we can go directly from here to there. What are the feed loops in social media? They're
Uh-huh,
only in one direction. They're
only,
not complex feed loops. They do not mimic. They do not. It is not a platform that supports the complex feed loops in actual discourse.
right.
They only amplify in one direction.
Hmm.
So this is,
Amplify the sort of salience or
yeah,
amplify the clicking,
the
yeah.
click. They have one or two
Hijacking
goal.
the amygdala, I think it was what how
Exactly,
Zach put
exactly.
it, yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
So it's going to disrupt normal discourse because it impedes the feed loops to be as rich as they need to be for normal discourse to happen.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And then, of course, the more people spend time in that kind of environment, then their brain gets in patterns. So the feed loops themselves are simplified or reductive because
Yeah.
whatever you.
We have
So,
beef only. Did you read that article?
yes.
We have this beef only. We have a kind of medieval sort of Game of Thrones society where we're just regressing to our most stupid
Yeah,
base
but
instincts, you know.
but this is also, we have to be careful because
Okay.
this is that past is primitive
Yeah.
assumption, and
Oh,
this is
right. Okay.
not
Yeah.
true.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I also
So
noted that as well. I thought, okay, actually a knight, he was talking about knights and he was talking
yeah,
about knights and territories, and a knight is actually a beautiful concept. But this is just such a flatland view of
yeah.
how things are and how people are. Um,
This
you
is
know,
this is how
it's a
modern.
video game world that he's
Yes,
describing.
this is
He's
how
not describing
modern people
death.
are. This is
Uh-huh.
not how foraging societies are.
Right.
This is
Great.
how
Yeah.
modern people are, and we keep,
Yeah.
the modern person's amygdala has been hijacked. The
Yeah.
amygdala itself is
It's fine.
very
Yeah.
intelligent.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, um, yeah. So just like there's a lot of moving parts and that we have to be careful of. Like, so a lot of what I do when I do group process is exactly this. We just trying to keep people out of the assumptions of the dominant discourse because it will always, Jordan Hall calls it malware. You
Mm-hmm.
can't
Malware.
think
Yeah.
from that paradigm and move out. It's
Uh-huh.
too recursive, it's too strong, it's too,
Okay.
um,
And then just can I'm sorry if I interrupt too
no, no, no,
much.
keep us
I was
going,
thinking
Michael.
about how there's that going on, and then there's this conversation going on. So it seems like the two things are happening simultaneously. There's all of this interesting stuff that's out there, which you can learn from, long form
Hmm.
discussions, which are deep and interesting, and then it's like an extreme. There's that happening, and then the other extreme is this sort of soundbite, very negative, almost regressive mode of communication happening at the same time. Like I see those things kind of happening simultaneously. Does that
Yeah,
does that make any sense?
yeah, but I think that there's a question. We were actually, a group was actually asking this question, and it's not clear how much the behavior on social media is driven by the algorithms.
Hmm.
I think it's a lot more than you think. I think that the behavior on social media, the discourse on social media is driven by,
Well, it's like crack cocaine.
yeah,
It's like somebody gave everybody acid.
Yeah.
I heard somebody was saying that, right? It can't be underestimated, you know.
Yeah.
Although I don't want to be like, you know, I don't want to I don't want to be dramatic or melodramatic about it, but
For example, I have
yeah,
almost was it 3,000 or 5,000? I forgot what the limit is. I have,
5,000 friends, yeah.
yeah, I have like almost 5,000 friends on my Facebook page.
Hmm.
And, you know, I'm in this group that's grown to 1,000, and it's starting to be, as they grow to that limit, to be completely chaotic and dysfunctional.
It breaks down at a certain
Right.
point, yeah.
But so I say the algorithms in a group are different than the algorithms on my Facebook page. I have 5 times more people there, but I don't have that dysfunction. It's quite quiet
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
respectful. And so the
Hmm.
way the algorithms work are different in groups. Um, and I think that's why you get the kind of dynamics
So it's
in
an
groups.
algorithm that's almost trying to turn people against each other.
Of course, because
Yeah,
the more that it can prioritize like these sparks of activity, which
yeah,
are emotional, then the more it keeps your attention, and that's what it wants. It wants you to be attention, and it wants your interaction with the hardware to be emotional, because that creates a coupling, an addiction coupling. So
an
every time
addiction.
you're emotional, so first the hardware creates the emotional, and then every time you're emotional, you go and pick up the hardware,
Yeah.
right? So it creates this one directional, again, not complex, not rich feedback loop, but a exponentially amplifying feedback loop.
Yeah, yeah. Um, when I was talking to Zach, again, I have Zach, my conversation with Zach Stein very much in my mind, and you know, he doesn't use social media,
Mm-hmm.
and he was telling me, and that he almost would say think it's unethical to use it just because of how much, you know, sort of money that these companies are making from people's, you know, most intimate, you know, feelings and emotions and all that. So why are we still using it? I mean, why are intelligent people still using it? Do you think we should be using it, or you think something else is coming next, or that we can jump onto that will be better? Or
I think there is an ethical question component to it.
Mhm.
I think that um, I think that one of the things about social media, as is true for a lot of technology we engage in it, the ethical component is very demanding. And so you have to constantly ask yourself, am I at choice here? Am I at choice here? Am I at
Ah,
choice here?
hmm.
So there's a due diligence um, that is part of it. And then at a certain point, and you know, and I think this is more true for me than Zach, and so I really respect Zach's, is like at a certain point, are you at choice for all the energy you're putting into the system to be at choice, right?
Hmm.
So I think that that social media is an experiment. I think that if you can keep that more like an experiment, um,
Yeah, for example, I remember you saying that you would share positions from different political parties or from different perspectives, or rather than trying to remain in this kind of you know, bubble feedback loop where you're just getting your own confirmation bias confirmed over again.
yeah,
Confirmation porn. Somebody said that somewhere, which I thought was a good
exactly. I mean,
insight.
so I think it's interesting to have it open up many perspectives. But again,
Hmm.
you have to do due diligence.
Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh.
Is it just clickbait, or is this some real person on the other side of opinion that is also doing due diligence? And I think I think it comes a point where social media is not helpful, and I often wonder at what point it is for me.
Yeah,
Um,
me too. Yeah.
and especially now, many of us are deep enough in cyberspace so that there are ways, like we can find Zach. That's great. I mean, it would be
Yeah,
horrible if you couldn't find people like Zach,
exactly. Yeah. Hmm.
And so the question is, once you establish enough networks, then how do how do
Then
you
you can
pull
jump off
how do
into
you pull
something
the
else,
plug?
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's how you pull the plug, I think. Yeah. Oh, that kind of brings me up because you mentioned this word parallax, that um, I'm working with a guy named Tom Amark. I
Mm.
think you did a podcast with him, and his magazine is called Parallax Magazine, and we're working with Alexander as well, and we wanted to make this magazine into a kind of a learning platform. Um, it's kind of our ambition at the moment, and we've been talking about this for a while, and now we're talking about it openly. So I wanted to get maybe your advice on how we could do that, like how something like that could be done. We're making a video and we're going to put it
Yeah.
out on YouTube and podcasts and that kind of thing. And that's how it gets to people. But again, we haven't pulled the plug. We haven't found we haven't found a space for, let's say, intelligent people that want to be thinking in a parallax world.
Yeah, I
Or
think it's, these are not, these are questions and experiments that are not yet answered. I
yeah,
think we're
sure.
experimenting our way to them, and what's interesting is the shelf life of these innovations or these initiatives is starting to
Mm,
get really short. So for example, the intellectual dark web, it
yeah,
came, it went.
yeah,
It came, it wowed, it went, right?
yeah.
Um, and even like I mean, I was very happy to be on this podcast with you because it's so much more like a conversation and not like trying to capture a certain segment or sector.
Oh, I'm glad you
Um,
said that. Yeah,
and, so uh, there's this, and I love Zach said it. He's like, at some point, a podcast, like we
yeah,
have a podcast with Zach. At some point, it's not entertainment; it becomes despair, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, yeah, it would be a conversation. It wouldn't be marketing. Like marketing's over. Like there's no need to be all markety about it. Does that make sense? So we don't have to
yeah,
we don't have
exactly.
to put on some kind of a persona and have a deep voice and all this music and stuff. It's almost like the raw thing.
Yeah.
More.
But then the question becomes, and I'm not saying, these are things I think you're probably trying to answer,
Yeah.
and that is like, then what is the public or performance nature of it?
Mm,
And
exactly.
some of the work that Hannah Arendt did um, comes to mind because she talks about, there's a private sphere and there's a public sphere.
Mm,
And the Greek polis is when you came into the public sphere, um, and what did you share, right? And
yeah.
the question here is, with the rise of the internet, it's almost like everything is public, everything is the polis. So what are the new rules? What are the new rules for engagement? And um, and you become virtual versions of yourself. So something you say on a video can get clipped and put over here, and now you exist. If you have any kind of social capital, that's influence. If you're an
Mm-hmm.
influencer, now you exist influencing the opposite of maybe what you wanted to say.
Yeah.
And these are big questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. Well, I think in a way we do have to go back into smaller communities, don't we? Um, Smaller hubs and smaller smaller worlds, because when something is too big, it's corrupt. Does
Yeah.
that make any sense, or is that?
Yeah. So I talk about it as we all our worlds are becoming us's, like they're just identities, like us versus them. It's like a thin category.
Yeah.
And what we don't have anymore are we's, and we's are units of agency. So if you're on a team, like a baseball team, you say we did it. It's so
Yeah, sure.
clear, but when what we're doing, and so maybe it's the Dunbar number, but for me, it's not the number, but it's the point at which you feel that the collective is the unit of agency.
And
And
intimacy, like there's a real relationship between each person,
exactly.
and not like a hyper relationship between them. Not like the person is, this on a stage and you're in the audience, or the person is, just a persona, or where there's a real, I guess that's what a church is, or a temple, or they're always, you always know everybody at the church or at the temple.
Yeah, but sometimes not. Sometimes a religion versus a church or a parish, I would say, becomes an us, because you're not actually a unit of agency. You're not participating in the enactment of some kind of world.
Oh, you're a cult rather than a
or you're just I'm a Christian. Well,
sure.
I'm not enacting the things the Catholic Church does, let's say. I'm not enacting the things that my religion does, and I don't even agree with maybe it. So, what is
Well, how to keep it living, I think what I'm hearing from you is how to keep the community a living community.
Yeah. So if I associate with something like, I don't know, any kind of ideology or any kind of category, like I'm a female, okay?
Yeah.
Well, my we is not female. I don't experience all women together doing something together like a we on a team. It's not a unit of agency. It's just a categorical identity. And what you see is more and more people are identified with categorical identities, and they don't actually enact things as groups. They don't actually have we's that have goals and aims that they come back to and focus on as a group. One of the early things I found out when I started doing group process, dialogic process, is that it's not about just learning how to talk to each other. So, and in these group processes, you always have the tension between the individual and the collective, the autonomy and the relationality.
Yeah.
That is like two legs of a three-legged stool. In history, all collectives are also solidified by action. That's why the family is powerful. You're not just an individual and a collective. You have things to do, a home to build, food to create. There's a unit of locus of production inside the collective.
That's different than being like, a French citizen or something, or.
Exactly. So when you have these we space groups that don't have the third leg of the three-legged stool, they don't have actual work, actual goals, or a project. They actually don't let the world in, and they're saying, oh, humans can be, transformative just by individual and collective, intersubjective and individual sovereign actions. It's not true. We've cut ourselves off from the other aspect of what being a human collective is, and that's the engagement with the world. You have to let the world in. The world solidifies. So, for example, it works both ways, because, like, you could have a dysfunctional community, and then a hurricane hits, and everybody's together, because the action solidifies, grounds the discourse. So all these practices are sure to fail if they stay at the level of discourse. And this is also why some of these You have to remind this in your podcast. So how do you build? So you and Tom and Alexander will be really doing something in the world, but how do you express that call to action to your audience to make
Yeah.
a we? And this is again, this is one of the blind spots in a lot of these practices. And something on Facebook, there is no world there. So like in Game B Facebook,
There's no world there. Is that what you said?
yeah, there's no
Yeah, there's no
work.
world.
So
There's no work. There's no work
yeah,
there. It's
which
just you
the
know, it's just
right. So we constantly say, this Facebook group is not Game B. Find people, make a choice, do an experiment in the world.
in the
That's
world.
Game
Oh,
B.
yeah, yeah.
So
So
this,
it can't be just a media platform. It has to be sort of events as well. It has to be people getting together to do actual projects.
if you want coherent collectives, the
Yeah.
world has to be the third leg of the three-legged stool. The actual work in the world, your
Actual work in the world.
body, the work that you do, the we,
Yeah.
or else you're not going to get coherence.
Great.
And so all those forms that don't realize that are destined to just be incoherent.
Great. You mentioned if there was a hurricane or something like that, we would all get together and we suddenly become human, right? Suddenly have real relationships with each other instead of just walking around like zombies.
Yeah.
You know.
But
but then the question is like, how do you do that in just ordinary life when there isn't when the world isn't falling apart all around you
well, the way we used to do it
the way we used
is
to do it? Yeah.
we would create art or sing, cook together or dance. There would always be things to do. And so when you take this into the workplace, so one of the reasons why a lot of people doing collective discourse practice have started to work with organizations is because they do have a goal or an aim. But in many organizations, there isn't. What you're actually asked to do is decoupled from the goal or the aim of the whole itself. So you have what Graeber calls bullshit jobs, right?
Bullshit jobs. Yeah.
Yeah. So you start to have you start to see people going into the workplace and having more loyalty to a small silo because they're going to have a picnic or they're going to do something. They're actually doing something together, but in the context of their career, they don't feel like they're doing something with the organization because it's a bullshit job. So this is another way of saying you need the sovereignty, the autonomy of the individual, you need the relationality of the collective, and you need agency. You need action in the world, and then the system coheres.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only reason we do bullshit jobs is to make money, right? To survive.
I don't know. I don't think I ever had one.
You never had one? Well, yeah, you must be very fortunate.
Oh, yeah.
Or very also work very hard to be in that position. I didn't mean to.
No. I did in high school. I worked in a factory to save money to go to college. And that was a kind of a bullshit job. But then after that,
well, I guess I washed dishes, and things like that. I worked in restaurants and on fishing boats, and those aren't really bullshit jobs. Like working class jobs are not bullshit jobs because it's the kind of job where you're putting numbers into Excel files, that seem to me to be sort of so dehumanizing.
Yeah, I mean, I worked in a like what is it called? Not a deli, but we're like a catering industry arm of a big store in California, and I learned so much about cooking and spices and food farm to table, So the benefits of that job, it wasn't highly paid, but it didn't feel like a bullshit job, And then after that, I ran my own companies in landscape design, architecture, contracting. So, um, so,
So I think that the things you do have always been very practical. Again, that's what I was struck by your writing and the fact that you do very practical things, and then but you're also working with these high abstract concepts and trying to bring the two together. And well, so a lot of the sort of stuff that people do around getting together and like talking and doing dialogue and all that sort of stuff often feels quite flaky and narcissistic to me
Mm.
because yeah, for that exact precise reason that you're saying. It's like, okay, we had this good feeling together, we had this good communal feeling together. It's like, so what? That's I always want to say is anyway.
Yeah, and I think the good feeling is an important experience, but then
or
when it
or
becomes the whole,
or catharsis or
yeah,
shadow work and
yeah,
all this, it's just endless
it is
somehow.
endless.
There's no
So
end to it. So you
I
have to
was
ground it in something, in doing something real, or it seems just a kind of upper class pastime, or I don't know.
yeah,
Maybe I'm being too insulting here with my.
no, I just was talking about this with the future thinkers people, and
Uh-huh.
the thing is, you know, uh, popular Western psychology, over psychologizes everything. This is
Yeah.
kind of a thing. And there's a little bit of an entertainment factor in it. Like when people don't know what else to do, they can start deconstructing their psyche. Now, part of that is helpful, but what happens is when you're in these extended groups, the psyche, one of the nature of the psyche is to create structures. So
Mm-hmm.
so you have, for example, people that will work with internal family systems, and they have like, the inner child and the father and the mother and the policeman. And then I know people who then think the inner systems themselves have inner systems. And so the psyche can you have to be careful, because as you're working with psychological structures, you'll end up creating more psychological structures that you have to work with. So it is infinite. It's a
Mm.
self-proliferating process, the
Ah.
psyche. And if you don't know about this, you think you're actually finding more and more complexity. You're getting to something, but you're building it up as you
Yeah.
deconstruct it. So
And we can
people,
relate that to iotrogenesis, this medically created diseases, in a way.
yeah,
It seems to
yeah,
me that's what happens is that the more complex solutions we come up to things, and we're actually creating harm.
yeah, or at least if it's not harm, it's complexifying things. I think it's Carl Wake. He has this great little metaphor. He says, the human body is very complex, and we could think of it, the psyche also. And if I'm sick, like, then I go to a doctor. Now the system's even more complex, because not only do I have the complexity of the human body,
Mhm.
but I have the complexity of the medical doctor's paradigm, and the medical doctor's complexity and his interpretation of me, and there might be some political or social class kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that move is hyper complexifies the illness. Just that one move, and the medical
Yeah.
doctors inside the institution and the insurance company and this and that. So how as a society do we improve? How can we intervene at the lowest level of complexity as
Uh-huh.
possible?
Oh, great. Yeah.
So
Mm.
this is Ivan Illich says this. Ivan Illich, you were talking about him. He says, we have but because of our society, we've given people the impression that self-care is inadequate, self-learning is deficient,
Yeah.
self-work
Yeah.
is less valuable. So it makes
He
us
calls
more,
that the shadow economy, like
yeah,
all the things people do, which are devalued, but which are actually often the most valuable thing.
exactly.
Like being a mother, for example, or.
exactly. And every
Yeah.
move toward the next level of complexity hyper complexifies it, right?
Mhm.
So if I know something about my own body and can work with my own body, that's less complex than going to a doctor. Now, if I have to make that move, okay, but
Yeah.
the it's I tell my students, solve your problems at the lowest level of complexity that you can. They're
Oh,
the
that's
same,
that's
they're the
great.
same problems,
Yeah.
so deal with them there.
Mhm.
Don't go to a doctor to figure out how to solve your problem with your mother. Go talk to your mother.
Right. Great. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, that's hard. It's kind of hard to talk to your mother. It's much easier to go talk to a therapist for 10 years and
Uh,
oh, my mother, my relationship with my mother. Yeah. I was thinking about, yeah, well, you had some interest in your discussion with David Fuller, A Rebel Wisdom. I thought you had some interesting insights about men and women and that whole thing.
yeah,
That I thought was very, very useful. So,
yeah. So I'd like to kind of expand that a little because I don't
mhm.
want it to degenerate into a man and woman, even
Oh yeah.
though I
Hmm.
kind of set it up that way. Um, so this is kind of what I call a heuristic or a little taxonomy of the types of behaviors people tend to show up with in group process. And I think on the rebel wisdom, I talked about the ranker and the belonger.
Yeah.
These are two out of the 8. But there's something, a deeper psychological schema underneath how you show up. So for example, and there's 3 structures in this typology. So there's what's called the primary psychological schema. This is from Gurdjieff's work,
Oh,
and
Gurdjieff.
that
Wow.
is,
Okay.
uh, yeah, do you take power
Gurdjieff's
or
grave
seek
is just like.
approval?
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh,
You mentioned Gurdjieff's grave, and Gurdjieff is like. I live in Avon, France, where he had his big monastery, and his grave's about a block away from my house.
yeah,
Anyway, that's just an aside. Sorry, excuse me for interrupting your.
yeah. So the primary psychological structure or the strategy of the child is
Mhm.
either to take power or seek approval.
Mm.
Sometimes that's highly gendered, um, sometimes not. But this is like the primary. So the ranker
Mm.
takes power, has learned as a child to take power. The
Mm.
belonger to seek approval. So that's one aspect of it. The
Mhm.
second aspect is what I call social processing typology. So when come into group space, we have social anxiety.
Yeah.
It's part of being a mammal, really.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
energy comes up, and so uh, so there's another typology. Some people turn that energy into talking about their emotions and using story. So that's a
Narrative. Mm.
narrative approach. And some use mental models and abstractions,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So then there's either narrative or abstract or concepts, let's say. And then the third piece is how we've been trained to think about collectives. And comes from our social or political kind of background. And so
Mm.
one typology is the focus on individuals' rights and responsibilities,
Mm-hmm.
and the
Mm-hmm.
others on collective rights and
Okay, so
responsibilities.
you have Jordan Peterson on one side, and then you have the social justice warriors on the other, or
Right,
something like that.
right. So
Hmm.
a ranker
Yeah.
is my archetype for a person whose psychological schema is power, processing temperaments, concepts, and individual rights. And you'll see,
Uh-huh.
and a belonger is approval, narrative, and collective. And
Hmm.
if you take these 3 things, it, it creates a matrix of 8 social types. And I've done this in workshops where people
8.
just, yeah,
Yeah, you have precisely 8 different types. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
because the combination of these 3 in different combinations gives you 8 types.
Uh-huh. Wow.
So the ranker is power, concepts, and individual, but you could have power, concepts, and collective. That's a different one, a
Mm-hmm.
different archetype. And what I've done in some of my early work, I mean, it's kind of a fun typology. It's not that intellectually rigorous, but people will take the test. They'll answer the 3 questions. When you are a child,
Mm-hmm.
relative to other kids, did you take power or seek approval? And they will recognize their archetype based upon these structures that are operating on them. And so my point in the rebel wisdom was that people, people have biases. They think that one of these archetypes is better in collective
Yeah.
space than the
Yeah.
others. And I say, no, they're just different archetypes of the social self. And what the first stage is in collective process is to move beyond the social self into
Mm-hmm.
more authentic selves. So
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
it's just it's typology and
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, often the belonging stuff, has its form of manipulation, right? Just as
Well,
the
exactly.
just as the ranking stuff has its form of manipulation. So ranking stuff is the more obvious kind of male, I would say,
Yeah, but the
quality. It
point
was one person trying to be tougher than the other, and then the belonging is more probably more female, or is that too reductive?
it's reductive. The point
It is
is
reductive, yeah.
they're both social selves. They're social strategies to reduce anxiety, and they're both distortions of the authentic self. So none of them. You don't want them in.
Yeah.
As you move along,
Whether
they
you're
need
a
to be
man or a
overcome.
woman, you wouldn't want them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was just saying some of the confusion in social space, social collective practice was a lot of the initial circles were convened by people who thought the belonging needs person was
Oh
in the
yeah,
right direction
I've noticed that. Yeah.
because there was a bias against the ranking, and neither of them are in the right direction. They are actually the same structure that
Uh-huh.
needs to be resolved.
Yeah, and often it's also I would see it as people who are really into emotionality and feeling and expression
Yeah, that's because
drama queen type of people
yeah, but here's the
who run the show, and then the geeky little people over here is like we're lost in abstraction or are completely lost. And
and we can see how the other archetypes are distorted, but we think ours have values, you
yeah,
know,
exactly. Yeah.
and they're all they're all distortions. So yeah, and then there's gifts. The ranker becomes very perceptive and tends to be a theory builder. These
To
higher
build theories. Yeah.
yeah. So you start to see them as you get more capacity in these groups. If you stick together, that's kind of the mature contribution the ranker has. To the belonger
Mm-hmm.
is the person that is experiencing, wow, I feel like no, I feel like we should stay on this, and their way of processing becomes an asset. But they're not clutchy like when they first start and have all these belonging needs. They're released of those contractions.
Mm-hmm. So there's a neurotic form of that and an enlightened form of that, so to speak.
Exactly.
Right.
There's a gift inside the distorted typology.
Yeah. 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 Well, that's what another thing I've been thinking about is um, I've mentioned Zach about 20 times in this interview, so if he's out there, I apologize. But I can't stop. I can't stop thinking about the stuff he's been saying, and he talked about his high level dyslexia, and he talked about how that was like, it's a personality who you read the paragraph before you read the sentence, before you read the word, so you go from top down instead of bottom up, and that kind of, and I think I'm not exactly the same as Zach, because I'm not so gifted and a dyslexic, but I know that I function in that way,
Yeah.
and that's made it very difficult for me in some areas, especially school, whereas I kind of excel in other areas. And so in terms of our discussion about education and how to fit in these people that maybe don't fit in the ordinary typologies, or a bit sort of
Yeah.
lost in the functioning kind of world. And I've known a lot of people like that in my life. I tend to enjoy people who are a bit odd or strange, or have
Yeah.
wacky minds, or just different kinds of minds.
Yeah. So in my educational philosophy, I talk about the switch from complex adaptive systems, so like uh, the Darwinian model of education is dyslexics have to adapt to the reading program
Right.
versus complex potential systems. All of a sudden, wow, what's potential from here? This is a different mind, perhaps a whole new mind. What is the potential of this that I'm facing? To educate is to bring forth the potentials, that to notice, identify, detect, and amplify the potentials that are in front of me, not to force that emergent potential into a pre-designed or preordained adaptation plan.
Yeah.
That's called, curriculum, or and
Or standardized testing and all
or
that sort of stuff.
yeah, or even thinking that a third grader is going to move from here to here, because what we're noticing in like early childhood research, psychological research, Alison Gopnik is great for this, is that there are metacognitive abilities that come online early in childhood. And so if we assume these things are only going to come online when someone's 18, 19, or 20, then we miss these emergent pathways that may be staring us right in the face. Maybe all this deviant behavior in schools is our inability to ask ourselves, what's the potential that's arising here? I mean, that can get
So if
overboard.
you get a hyperactive kid who has this kind of wild energy and he can't sit still, he should be, I don't know, working with horses or something, or he should be,
Exactly. It's I say this all the time in organizations. It's energy for free. Here's the teacher, and you're looking at energy for free. How can I shape the form that's going to take? I mean, literally, it's crazy. You're looking at energy. You're looking at purpose driven. You're looking at impulse and instinct and desire. These are the fundamental protocols for civilization right there in your face. And what we're going to do, we're going to drug them.
Yeah, and they're all there, aren't they? All of these, as you say, protocols for civilization. The whole, all the typology, all the different types are just sitting there, waiting to be used, and we're corralling them into this very narrow perspective.
As Whitehead said, we have to move from this notion of constraint and control to see the world is screaming with affordances. I mean, literally screaming with affordances. And this is the, I think, mindset that gets us beyond the sense making and meaning making crisis and into being able to literally see the potentials staring us in the face, but they're categorized as problems or deviance. And
It's funny, because when I'm talking to you compared to my conversation with Zach very, very, very deep into this apocalyptic sort of feel to what's going on right now, and you have a very you have a way of making one feel very hopeful about the world, in a sense, right? If we could sort of see all of this chaos as potential, as abundance rather than scarcity, and work with that. Of course, we're in trouble in a lot of ways as well. We can't deny that, but
well, actually, one of the things that Zach and I both are warning of, and I haven't said it so dire, but if you don't take the problems with society seriously, then you're just being snookered, right? You'll say, oh, here's a new potential, but it'll be
Yeah.
the same structure, just in more disguise, it'll be the same problem undercover.
Right.
So we have to come to terms with the fact. And so the way I describe that is by saying, no, you have to exit this paradigm. You have to get outside of, I mean, if you try to think of complex systems outside of adaptation, we have to adapt. Try to tell all your stories without using that subtle mental model that you have to adapt to something. It's almost impossible.
Yeah,
you know,
you can't adapt to it.
because you're saying, I don't want to use that paradigm, that Darwinian paradigm. So then what do I use to talk about complex systems? And yeah, and I think
And also,
that,
it may have been that paradigm had its value in its time, but it just keeps going, and becoming more of a monolithic kind of dead structure, right?
it is, and
Yeah.
we're at one of these times when all civilizations become, their paradigms become deficient, and you end up in times of transition. And yeah, I mean, I didn't find Zach's, I'm sorry, we're talking about you, Zach.
Yeah.
I didn't find that interview disheartening.
Oh no.
I found it very clarifying,
Yeah. I agree with you. I would say that I would say that he says that we have to look through the thing, right? Which is not saying that we're stuck or we're blocked, or we can look through the thing. But he's saying that he is also saying the world is burning. So, if you're in the middle of the fire. So I think if you're the kind of person that wants to has a hunger for truth, then that kind of message just wakes you up and makes you feel more alive. If you're a person who wants to retreat back into safety and comfort and habit, then maybe that would seem depressing or something like that, to some people.
Exactly. I mean, I think that what I will kind of say in terms of my own despair is, I don't see people changing. I don't see masses of people changing. I see hope, potential in small initiatives. And so when Zach talks about his hub and spoke network of education, I think these are smart designs for the possible transition. I don't see, I think the whole strategy to change massive.
Well, that's what I was about to say. I would say, why would you want to change everybody? I mean, that seems there's something wrong in. I was listening to one of your talks where you talked about how I think so. It has to be a local. Everything has to be very local, and that's where you have to work with. Otherwise, you're pretending. If you felt that you were participating adequately or learning, then that would be okay, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least you have to have theory practice consistency. So and this, I think, where Zach really shines, because he's like, social media, we all know it's really problematic. And
so he gets out.
We go on social media saying how it's problematic. So there's a theory practice inconsistency there. Now that tension can go either way. Maybe we say, well, it's not as problematic as I thought, or yes, it is, but at a certain point, you have to strive for more coherence between the theory, what you're espousing, and the choices that you make. And everything has to start with a choice. And I think that's the linchpin. I think it'd be easy to get people to conceptualize change, even if it's in very high metacognitive terms. That seems easier to me than for them to take a first real step.
And the first real step you would describe as coherence. What do you mean by that?
No, I think the first real step is, for example,
Or that's
like,
maybe a goal, coherence, excuse me. Maybe
yes, the
coherence is
goal.
more of a goal, and the first step would be directing yourself towards that, or taking concrete actions and going in that direction.
Yeah, it's kind of like, what is it? Iontogenetic. What's that
Yeah, I have
word
a
again?
really hard time with that word. I get, maybe it's just the way it looks. Iatrogenesis.
Yeah. So if you truly believe that, if you truly don't think the medical institution is helpful, that the medicine is making you sick, then
don't take the medicine.
don't participate in the medical system. You know, I have a long background in Qigong, in self-care and well-being. I don't have health insurance. I have two nurses. My mother and my sister are nurses. And, you know, you can see this, the doctors, I know more about some of the history, like, just like Zach Stein knows more about some of the psychological, psychopharmacological things than the actual people who prescribe the pills. You know, it's like, there's this illusion of professionalism in medicine.
Yeah.
And so if you get parishes, people doing Qigong and learning about the human body and learning about holistic health and healing, that is more powerful medicine than the medical institution. And yet all the discourse is Medicare for all, or this or that. I mean, I don't see why people want to expand the US medical system. It doesn't make any sense.
Wow.
It's just, so that's what I mean by choice.
Many people would hear you say that and think that you were a very wicked person because you're wanting people to be dying on the street. Or, I mean, that's the kind of the level of discourse today, is that you can't really talk about anything like that in polite society because it's so dichotomous. It's so you know, all these things are very complex and deep. And
yeah, unless your friends are doctors and you hear the back channel, then you know.
Then you know.
And then you know. And so, but my point is that, I mean, that's a big step. But at some point, you know, it needs, there needs to have, you need to tie your values, your espoused values, to choice. And then that moves you along into action, and it changes the world. But espousing values does not change the world.